At Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health, we strive every day to deliver results you can see in your animal's productivity and your bottom line. From a smooth transition into the milking string for your fresh cows, to a happy welcome home from your furry friend. From a strong start in your poultry flock, to consistent weight gains for your finishing hogs. We expect to earn your business and your trust with our people, our products, and our science. Our people have an intense passion for your animals and your success. You can count on us for honest, candid advice and practical solutions for your toughest challenges. As the global leader in choline production, chelation, and encapsulation technology, we take our obligation to you and to the environment seriously. Our products are backed by the most extensive and thorough research portfolio, while our business is committed to advancing environmental sustainability and animal welfare. In the end, it all comes down to results. Balchem delivers real results you can count on, results that exceed your expectations, and results that bring true value to your bottom line. Leading the charge to meet the nutritional needs of ruminants, monogastrics, and companion animals, Balchem offers a growing portfolio of nutritional products and a dedication to innovation and industry sustainability. Balchem is here to solve today and shape tomorrow. With today's low milk prices and rising feed protein costs, now is the time to turn up the dial on rumen efficiency. NitroSure precision-release nitrogen is designed to help stabilize rumen ammonia pools by synchronizing carbohydrate and nitrogen availability to the microflora. Providing a consistent supply of ammonia is proven to increase rumen microbial populations, improve fiber and dry matter digestibility, and stimulate microbial protein yield, all leading to greater efficiencies in forage utilization and higher milk and milk component production. Maximize rumen microflora with NitroSure to turn up rumen efficiency and productivity.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. Feed efficiency is more important than ever as the cost of ration ingredients and other inputs on the farm become more expensive. In today's Real Science webinar titled Improving Feed Efficiency for Financial and Environmental Sustainability, we will address how cows are changing and how feeding them differently can impact both the environmental footprint and the financial efficiency of the operation. Dr. Mike VandeHaar from Michigan State University has spent more than a decade researching and developing practical techniques to accomplish this. Dr. VandeHaar has been a professor of dairy nutrition at Michigan State University since 1988. He grew up on a dairy farm in Iowa and completed his PhD at Iowa State University. A major focus of his research in the past 10 years has been to improve feed efficiency through genomics and nutrition management. He has published more than 300 manuscripts, conference proceedings, and abstracts from his work. He's also developed software for balancing dairy cow diets and has taught nutrition to over 4,000 students. In 2013, Mike was awarded the American Feed Industry Association Award, and he currently serves on the board of directors for the American Dairy Science Association. Mike, you should now have control of the screen.
Well, thanks, everybody. I'm glad you're here today. As Scott said, I grew up on a dairy farm in Iowa, and my dad was a pretty progressive farmer. Back in the 1970s, when I was a teenager, our average production, rolling herd average, was about 17,500 pounds, which was pretty good. 45 years ago was great. And I specifically remember we had one heifer that produced more than 100 pounds of milk per day for about the first 150 days of her lactation. She was big, and my dad was very good at including his sons, not in just working, but also helping to think about managing the farm. And we had a lot of discussions about this heifer, number 114, because we had a magnet feeder, which for those of you who are young, you wouldn't remember, but magnet feeders were before the days of computer feeders. And what you did is you put a magnet on the cow's neck, and when she got close to the feeder, grain would dribble out. Well, she was a big heifer and she was pretty aggressive, and she sat at that magnet feeder. It seemed like every time we looked, she was there. So we had a lot of discussions about number 114. Was she efficient? Was she profitable? Is she the kind of cow we wanted more of? It turns out we didn't really have to think about that for a long time because we could never get her bred again, and her genetics were lost. But I've been thinking about efficiency probably ever since that time, so for 45 years. And I'm happy that I can share some of the thoughts that I have on feed efficiency with you today and share some of the work that we've done. I'm going to give I have three parts to my my talk. First, just a few introductory comments about feed efficiency. Then I'll talk about breeding for feed efficiency, and then finally feeding for feed efficiency. I won't spend a lot of time on profitability or environmental sustainability, but I'll make some points along the way. And before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge some colleagues who have been really important in my thinking on this issue and our work. Rob Templeman is an animal geneticist at Michigan State. And then at the University of Wisconsin, Lou Armentano, who many people know as a nutritionist, and Kent Weigel, a geneticist. And we've been working together on this project now for 12 years. So, okay, let's go. Okay, so first a little bit about the basics of feed efficiency. We can really divide it into three key areas. First, and I want to think about where do we waste feed on the farm? Where do we lose nutrients as we go from feed coming onto the farm, getting into the cows, and producing milk from it? First off, we waste some feed on the farm. I'm going to spend no time on that today, but it's important. Probably 10% of our feed gets wasted before we ever feed it to a cow. Next, we could think about the total feed energy that a cow consumes. Well, we call it gross energy, the total combustible energy that a cow consumes. And that is the same whether you're talking about wheat straw or corn grain. Okay, it has the same energy value. But when cows eat feed, they lose some of that feed because they don't digest it all. So they lose some feed as feces. They lose some feed energy as gas, methane. They lose some feed energy as urea in urinary nitrogen losses, and they lose some of their feed energy as heat, and then they bring it down to something we call net energy. This is the chemical energy that's actually useful to the animal. And then this net energy, some of it is actually used for the maintenance of the cow, just keeping her alive, keeping her heart pumping, her lungs moving in and out and moving air around, her brain thinking, etc. That's maintenance. And before you can ever make milk, you have to at least meet your maintenance needs. So some energy is lost as maintenance, and then what's left we can capture in milk or body tissues. So when we think about how to improve feed efficiency, we're going to think about these two last arrows separately. So I first want to think about how can we have more milk per unit of body weight, because that will mean that more of the total feed, she may have to eat more, but more of that total feed will be used for milk instead of lost as maintenance. And then the second one is how can we capture a greater percent of the gross energy of feed, the total combustible energy, as net energy? And that has to do with digestibility and nitrogen utilization and how much feed ends up being put out as methane or heat. The heat just of doing metabolic work of putting the feed into a more usable form. And then one more that's especially important in animal breeding now is residual feed intake. We'll spend some time on that. So in the end, if we increase efficiency will increase net farm income and keep dairy foods cost competitive with other types of foods. Improving feed efficiency also will improve environmental stewardship and reduce the negative impacts per liter of milk because a greater portion of our total feed is captured as milk instead of lost. So how have we been doing? Over the last 100 years, milk production has increased tremendously. This has been due to a number of different innovations and technologies along the way, but key among all of those are things that happened back in the 1940s. Okay, that's when we started doing quantitative genetics the way that we do it today. We had statistical sire evaluations and AI co-ops. It's also when the first nutrient requirements for dairy cattle was put out. And I'd argue that those two have gone together. The geneticists keep giving us new cows that produce more milk, and then as a nutritionist, we have to try to keep up with them and figure out how to feed those cows to meet their needs. Along the way, feed efficiency has doubled. Greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk have dropped in half. But most of this is because of the dilution of maintenance, the second part of that last scheme that I showed you. So we've increased milk production per unit of body weight. And that's happened because we were trying to increase milk production. It just so happened that an increase in feed efficiency was a byproduct, but that wasn't really our goal. Our goal was increased profitability. So if we look at feed efficiency per se, now this graph shows captured energy captured as milk and some body tissue divided by the feed gross energy that the animal consumed on the y-axis, and then multiple maintenance on the x-axis. In multiple maintenance, what I mean is what's the total energy requirement of the cow for milk, body tissue gain, and maintenance divided by her maintenance requirement. The cow eating at, say, 4 times maintenance requirement is producing probably about 100 pounds of milk per day. If a cow is eating at 1 times maintenance, okay, she's only eating to meet her maintenance requirement, her efficiency will be 0, okay, because all of her feed energy is going toward maintenance, none of it will be captured. So as a cow produces more and her energy requirement increases relative to maintenance, then a greater percent of her feed energy gets captured. But you'll notice that this line, this is data from about 5,000 cows in the first part of our study that we've had. There's a lot of scatter around this, but you'll notice that the line tends to have a decreasing slope. Okay, so and I'd point out that it doesn't matter. We move to the right whether we increase milk with the same body weight or whether we decrease milk or decrease body weight with the same milk. Either way, we dilute out maintenance, but as production per cow increases, efficiency increases with a diminishing response. And I would argue that for the future, okay, we've captured a lot of the increase in efficiency that can happen just because we're producing more milk. In the future, if we want to continue to have major increases in efficiency, we need to start focusing directly on feed efficiency as a trait. So let's talk a little bit about how we're thinking about doing that in animal breeding. So our goal is to select for cows that give more milk per unit of feed, to directly start selecting for feed efficiency. That means we need to produce more milk per unit of body weight. In the past, we've actually body size of cows has been increasing in the last 100 years. Okay, if you look at, in fact, if you look at an ideal cow from the 1950s, an ideal cow from 2010, there are a lot of things that have changed. This cow doesn't show it here, but she's probably taller. She weighs actually more than this cow from the 1950s. She's not as thick. She's got better dairy form. Whether that's really important, I'm not sure. But what you'll especially see is that her udder is considerably bigger. Okay, so we've been selecting for milk production over the last 60 years, no question about it. And along the way, feed efficiency has increased. We need to now think really hard about selecting for more milk per unit of body weight and trying to find cows that need less feed than expected, which is what we'll talk about when we talk about residual feed intake. Okay, so genomic selection has changed how we select cows. And we are able to do genomic selection today largely because of the Human Genome Project, which has taught us a lot about how the genome is put together. And it doesn't matter that much if it's a human. Cows have 2 sets of 30 chromosomes with 3 billion base pairs per set. Because of genomic breeding, as you know, traditional breeding values were based on performance of daughters. Okay, we couldn't never even think about breeding for feed efficiency directly in the past because we never knew how much feed the daughters actually ate. So we never knew feed efficiency for each individual daughter. But genomics allows us to select for new traits like feed efficiency and make decisions earlier on older ones. So I just want to, as a nutritionist, before I got involved with this project in 2010, I didn't really understand genomic selection, and it's really not that complicated. And I think it's useful. I recognize that most of our audience here is probably are people who are experts in nutrition, and I think it's helpful for you to understand just a little bit about how this works. Okay, so a lot of genomic selection is based on things called a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. This is a place in that 3 billion base pair long string of DNA, if you put all the chromosomes end to end, where you have a spot, a single nucleotide, where sometimes there's a C and sometimes there's a T if you look at one chromosome versus the other. Sometimes an animal may have 2 C's, maybe she have 2 T's, but there's a difference that you can see. And you know, along the way, animals have a lot of these single nucleotide polymorphisms, and we can select animals. Do we want the C or do we want the T? So we can start to look at a trait like feed efficiency, and we can say, animals that have a C at this particular locus in the genome seem like they produce more milk or are more feed efficient. Well, actually, for any given SNP, that effect is really small. Maybe a few, like milk fat, there's one SNP that has a pretty big effect, but for most SNPs, especially for a trait like feed efficiency, they all have very, very little impact. But when you put them all together, now you can start to see things. So the way that genomic selection works is we have a reference population of cows with known genotypes. We've measured the genotype. We've looked at maybe 78,000. In this example, I have 78,000 SNPs. That's one SNP for every about 40 or 50,000 base pairs. And so we know her genotype, and we've measured her phenotype. We've measured her residual feed intake. We've measured her milk production. We know her body weight. We know all of that stuff. And now we come up with a prediction equation. For each SNP, we say, how much effect does this SNP have on the trait? And do we have a T here or do we have a C? So we're going to give it a genotype. Is it a C or a T, or does it have one of each? It's a 1. If it has 2 T's, maybe it's a 2. If it has 2 C's, it's a 0. We know how much effect it has on our trait of interest, and then we come up with a genomic transmitting ability, add all of that together, and we come up with a genomic breeding value for a trait. We come up with a whole prediction equation that now we can apply to our selection candidates, which would be the sires that are out there that we can use in breeding our cows. That's the gist of genomic breeding. And just I'd point out that none of these SNPs have to necessarily actually affect the trait of interest. They're just correlated with they're related to the genes around them. So we can now select calves when they're even in utero to decide, is this going to be a sire that I'm going to want to have someday, breeding a number of the cows across the country or not? So what are the traits we're thinking about for feed efficiency? One is residual feed intake. which I like to think of as unjustified feed intake. So on the x-axis, I have the predicted intake of individual cows based on how much milk they produce, what's their body weight or metabolic body weight to the 3/4 power. What's their, are they gaining or losing body energy every day, NEG, body energy? And how are the other animals doing that are fed the same diet at the same place at the same time? So that's their cohort, kind of like when we think about herd mates in traditional breeding values. So animals that eat, and then we look at their observed intake, and animals that eat less than predicted have a negative residual feed intake. These are animals that must be doing something, we don't know what. They must either be digesting feed more efficiently or they just don't produce as much heat. We don't know, but for whatever reason, they seem like they can produce just as much milk as other animals at this level, but do it with less feed. Those are considered desirable cows. The heritability for RFI is 0.17, which is a kind of medium amongst all the traits we select for. Fertility, for example, is much lower than that. Body weight and milk production are higher than that. But it's a breeding, it's a heritability that's certainly something we can think about breeding for. And so that's one of the traits of interest for thinking about feed efficiency. The other one is body weight. I'm gonna spend just a little bit of time on body weight because I have to say that as a nutritionist, before I was involved with this project, I would go on to a farm that had big cows, and I will have to admit, I'm one of the people who would say, wow, these are cool big cows. Well, I think a lot of our farmers felt the same way. And so as a nutritionist, you have more impact on how farmers think about cow size than you might realize. And I hope to convince you today not to be one of those people who says, oh, these are cool big cows. I bet they're really productive. Or that's a really big cow. I bet she's a really good cow. I'd like to have more of her. Okay, so here's a correlations between various traits where on the top right side, we have the genetic correlation among traits. And on the bottom left, we have the non-genetic correlation among traits. If you look at milk energy and body weight, the non-genetic correlation is positive 0.2. Okay, so bigger cows actually do produce more milk. When you look at a bunch of cows in a barn, the bigger cows probably produce more milk. However, if you breed for bigger cows, you won't probably get more milk. The genetic correlation is much lower. Why might that be? Well, perhaps the bigger cows were healthier as calves. Maybe they were raised differently as heifers. I don't know. But for whatever reason, the non-genetic correlation is more positive than genetic correlation. Breeding for bigger cows does not give you more milk. Breeding for bigger cows gives you cows that eat more. It gives you cows that are less feed efficient. Gross efficiency is lower. Their income over feed costs won't be much different. So there's no reason to breed for bigger cows. In fact, there are reasons not to. Breeding for more milk gives you cows that eat more, but they're also more efficient and they have considerably higher income over feed costs. So we need to stop breeding for bigger cows. And I just point out that not only is the genetic correlation of body weight with feed efficiency negative, the correlation of stature with feed efficiency was even lower, negative 0.7. So breeding for taller cows is definitely a bad thing to do, but that's what we've often done because we are enamored by those animals in the show ring. So not only have our cows been getting bigger in the last 50 to 100 years, which is a problem because those bigger cows are not necessarily more efficient. In fact, they're less efficient. The maintenance requirement of cows has been increasing in the last 50 years, even when we put it on a body weight basis. And in the most recent, the NASM 2021, we've increased the maintenance requirement from 0.08 times metabolic body weight to 0.1 times metabolic body weight. And in fact, based on the research that's been done in the last 20 years, we considered increasing it to even higher than 0.1. Probably we should have increased it to 0.12, but we just weren't ready to make that big of a jump. But the next NRC may very well be increasing it even further. That means that you need to have, if you want to dilute out maintenance, you need to have even more milk than what I would have previously guessed. So with the NRC 2001, I often said, well, if once cows are producing about 140 pounds of milk per day, they're pretty much started to plateau on feed efficiency. Because the maintenance requirement has increased per unit of body weight, it's probably more like 180 pounds. So we've got a ways to go in terms of increasing milk production to the point where we've pretty much plateaued out for feed efficiency due to the dilution of maintenance. What's interesting is, why is the maintenance requirement gone up? Well, it seems as we've selected for cows that produce more milk, we've selected for cows that do everything faster, and the maintenance requirement has gone up. So who knows? Maybe it's time for us to even think about perhaps doing less selection purely for milk and really focusing mostly on feed efficiency in the future. This is just a slide to validate some of the things I've said, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is from Paul Van Raden in a 2018 report. He works for the USDA Animal Genomics Improvement Lab, and based on the most recent data, the genetic correlation of body weight, the body weight composite is how we evaluate body weight for Holsteins. 1 unit in body weight composite is about 35 pounds of mature body weight. There's a negative genetic correlation with milk yield, fat yield, protein yield, with health, with productive life, and with livability. So if you breed for larger and taller cows, you can expect daughters that will be bigger and taller, have better functional type traits, but they will not produce more milk. They will, in fact, probably even produce less milk. They may have shorter productive lives. They may die before they're sold. That's what livability has to do with, which is a really expensive thing to happen. They may have lower somatic cells, but they will have poor health, greater overall health costs. They will be have more calving problems, and they will be less profitable, because the correlation of the body weight composite with the overall net merit from 2018 was negative 0.2. It's time we stop breeding for bigger cows, and I hope that I've got a whole lot of nutritionists who are going to help get us to convince the general industry of this idea, because there are some people who aren't convinced of it. I think most people already know it's time to stop breeding for bigger cows. Just to share where we're at so far with the genetics, then stature and body weight are negatively correlated with feed efficiency. The maintenance requirement is increasing. It's higher, 25% higher than we thought. Residual feed intake is moderately heritable at about 0.17. And if you look at all the SNP markers, the top 10 SNPs only accounted for 7% of the variation in RFI, but all of the markers together account for about 14% of the variance in RFI, which is similar to the 17% heritability that I mentioned on the previous bullet. So those two numbers should match up pretty close. And finally, residual feed intake is a trait worthy of inclusion in net merit, but we do have a low reliability for it because we just don't have a lot of data. So we need to keep collecting data. So how are we using this? Well, I'm happy to say that there's a new trait that just got included in the net merit index in the past year, and it's called feed saved, and it's based on two things. So feed is saved when cows are smaller but produce the same amount of milk, and feed is saved when cows have a lower residual feed intake. Okay, based on some analyses from Beltsville's Genomic Improvement Lab and from Wisconsin, the daughters of the top bulls will probably consume about 200 pounds less feed per year, but produce about as much milk, if you look at the feed save variation in feed save PTA values. So if we consider two cows, a cow will you can have a cow will eat less. Feed will be saved because she's got a lower body weight, and feed will be saved because she has a lower residual feed intake. Now, this is only a 1% change in feed use per year, but remember it's cumulative. Okay, so if we breed the next generation to have greater feed efficiency, that will transmit to the following generations as well. So these are cumulative changes. The net merit has changed considerably over the last 50 years since it was first introduced. Originally, we had two things. We had milk yield and fat yield. Started adding in more traits about 2010. 2018, there were a lot of traits included, and the latest change in 2021, I shouldn't have a question mark here, was that we included feed saved. Feed saved is a trait that's based on body weight with a -9 weighting for body. Well, 9% of the total weighting of the 2021 net merit index is based on body weight, but it's got a negative instead of a positive. And 12% of the total weighting is based on residual feed intake for a total weighting of feed saved at 21%. Another way to look at that was published in Hoard's Dairyman this past year from Zhao Duer, who's the director of the Council for Dairy Cattle Breeding. And he just looks at it a slightly different way, but the body weight composite is about has a 9% weighting in the total net merit. RFI has, in the end, a lower weighting because its reliability is less. So considering that the reliability is much lower for RFI, even though we gave it a 12% weighting in the previous slide, because the reliability is lower, its effective weighting is only about 4%. So a lot of these traits aren't big, but remember they are cumulative. So the cows that we're going to select in the future will be different than the cows that we've been selecting for in the past. And we need to have more data collected simply so we can increase the reliability of RFI, and it will have a bigger impact in the future. I'd point out that with this body weight weighting, we expect about a 50-pound drop in body weight in the next 10 years in the Holstein population if we had 100% buy-in of people using net merit. So just to conclude that part, the use of feed saved will result in cows of moderate body size that convert consumed feed into milk and body tissues even more efficiently than they do now, and thus increase profit and environmental sustainability. Where we're at right now is we have another grant. This one is from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. I'm working with Wisconsin, Iowa State, and the University of Florida, as well as USDA Animal Genomics Improvement Lab. And our goal is to increase our reference population to improve reliabilities. We want to see if sensors can help us figure out how much cows are eating in individual and group fed systems. We want to see if what the relationship is between feed efficiency and methane emissions. That's not a huge goal of our group, but we're working with scientists in other countries who are putting more emphasis on that. And frankly, we just don't know yet whether more efficient cows, cows that have greater efficiency due to a residual feed intake, do they produce less methane? We don't know yet. In fact, you could almost argue that those cows, it seems like they digest fiber more efficiently. If you digest fiber more efficiently, you may actually produce more methane. So I'm not sure what this relationship will be. And then try to identify mechanisms that underline feed efficiency differences amongst cows. Okay, I'm not going to spend any time on this slide. I just want to say that another thing I would love to spend some time thinking about is, can we select for cows in the future that are better at using less protein? And I'm just going to call your attention to this paper that we published last year, and say that I think we could if we decided we wanted to. So now I want to talk a little about feeding and feed efficiency. And I'm going to skip over these bullets. I guess you're going to have access to these slides, or you'll have you can read this at a later time. But our goal is to stimulate milk synthesis. As a nutritionist, my goal is to stimulate milk synthesis so that we dilute out maintenance and then supply the nutrients for it at the right level so that we don't feed more protein than we need to, so that we use all those other nutrients efficiently as well. And I just point out that, if you want to increase feed efficiency, well, you have to think about what metric do I want to use to think about the trait. Because if I simply look at milk per unit feed, and we look at the gross energy of different nutrients and their net energy output, well, fat is more energy dense. So if I want to have more milk per unit feed, feed a high fat diet. But I would rather think about milk energy per unit feed energy, or per unit feed gross energy. And in fact, what I would really like to think about is income over feed costs, profitability. We know that nutrients interact with each other to alter energy available for making milk and thus feed efficiency. So I would just think a little bit about how some of these interactions happen. I want to start off talking about the energy scheme for the new NRC. So in the new NRC, it's much like NRC 2001. We have different feed organic matter fractions. We've added in a new one called residual organic matter. So we used to have NFC, non-fiber carbohydrate. That's now been divided into starch and everything else, the residual organic matter. And I'd point out that the digestibility of NDF in the new NRC is altered by how much the cow eats relative to her body weight and by the level of starch in the diet. And that's a new factor that's been included because we have a lot of data in the last 25 years on starch in diets, and we're now able to look at this. Okay, we put all these digested fractions together, come up with a DE value for a diet. We know we can predict how much urinary nitrogen is going to be produced by a cow based on how much protein she's consuming and how much protein ends up in milk, how much protein wasn't digested. The rest is probably urinary nitrogen. That gives us a urinary energy value. We can predict gas energy based on fiber digestibility and some other factors. So that gives us a metabolizable energy, a net energy value for the diet, and then we use that to meet the cow's needs. If we want to increase feed efficiency, we want to minimize our losses. So we want to minimize fecal energy. We want to minimize urinary energy losses, gas energy losses. We want to minimize heat losses. And finally, we want to minimize the amount of the total NEL that's used for body weight compared to milk. Okay, that's the dilution of maintenance component. And I would argue that to some extent, yeah, we could feed diets that have less fecal energy and heat loss, et cetera. We can do that, but is that always the right thing to do? Well, from an income over feed cost standpoint, it certainly isn't, because some byproduct feeds we know are going to have poor digestibility, but they're cheap. And because they're cheaper, you may even take a little bit of a hit on milk production, but the cows will give you more money. So feed efficiency is, of course, not the end all when you think about how to feed a cow. Income over feed cost generally is, but the two are at least sometimes correlated. I want to think just a little bit about this one, the effect of starch on NDF digestibility, because it's important for how we think about feeding cows in early lactation versus later lactation. So based on an analysis we did a couple of years ago, we know that NDF digestibility is influenced by both starch and how much a cow eats. Higher starch content decreases NDF digestibility. Okay, when you go from a diet that's about 20% starch to a diet that's about 30% starch, something that happens pretty frequently, at least in Michigan, your NDF digestibility, if you had a base digestibility of, let's say, and I should say our base digestibility in the new NRC is at a diet that's 26% starch. So base starch digestibility, NDF digestibility for this particular diet, or actually the average of all of our data in that study, was about 42%. If you fed a diet that was 30% starch, that would have dropped to about 37%. And if it was only 20% starch, it would have been about 45%. Okay, so over a 10 unit difference in starch content, we'd have a 6% drop in NDF digestibility. Increased intake also decreases NDF digestibility, but the effect is not as great as the effect of starch. Okay, so how does that affect energy available for cows to make milk? So as we increase starch concentration in a diet, normally you can expect that the digestible energy value of the diet would go up. Why? Because you're replacing starch that's very digestible. You're replacing, you're putting in that starch for NDF, which is less digestible, typically more like 40 or 50%. Starch is up around 90%. Okay, so if we didn't make the adjustment for NDF digestibility, then the solid line here is how DE values would change. However, if we account for the effect of starch on the NDF digestibility, then the DE value of the diet, the total diet, doesn't increase nearly as much as we expected it to. This becomes especially interesting when you think about feeding diets where you can either consider using starch or you could use a non-forage NDF source like soy hulls or corn gluten feed. So I want to look at this graph on the left side first here, where I made no adjustments to NDF digestion when I replace starch. So I have a diet here that's 35% starch, super high starch diet, and I'm going to replace that starch with non-forage NDF and forage NDF. And just pointing out that when you replace the starch with something like soy hulls, you're not going to get as much of a drop in the DE value of the diet as if you replaced it with non-forage NDF, okay? Because the soy hulls are more digestible than is a typical forage. However, when we use the new NRC, what you'll find is because starch depresses NDF digestibility, as you take starch out of the diet, NDF digestibility will be higher. So when you replace, and just draw your attention to the red line, when you replace starch with something like soy hulls, you can go from 35% starch down to 15% starch with very little change in the effective DE value of the diet. So for cows that can get by with a diet that has a lot of soy hulls in it and produce just as much milk, you can get just as much milk with the soy hull diet as with the corn because NDF digestibility wasn't altered. Now in real life, we know that high starch versus low starch is going to affect intake and partitioning of nutrients. We know that in early lactation, gut fill is often limiting, and starch, when you add starch, she can now eat more per day. So the real value in early lactation of adding starch is that cows can eat more. And therefore, even though the DE value of the high starch diet might not actually be much higher than, say, a high soy hull diet, she can eat more, she makes more milk, she dilutes out maintenance, she's more feed efficient. In later lactation, feed intake isn't limited as much by fill, and therefore, the high soy hull diet can be an effective way of feeding a cow in later lactation. The other thing about starch is that when you feed more starch, a cow tends to partition more of her energy to body fat than with a high NDF diet, because starch increases insulin and that increases the body's desire to make some body fat. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time on the next couple slides other than to say, you know, Mike Allen's done a lot of work on this over the years, and he's shown, as have others, okay, high forage NDF limits feed intake, especially in high producing cows. In later lactation, however, or in lower producing cows, NDF, high forage NDF doesn't really limit intake. So this is a time in later lactation when cows are producing less milk. This is a time when you could feed a high soy hull diet the cows will eat just as much. And in fact, as I'll show you in the next slide, oops, I'm going to skip this one too. I'll just say that we've come up with some new equations in the next NRC that will give you some indication of how feed factors might affect intake. I'm going to leave it at that. But I like this slide from 2009 that shows that substituting in beet pulp for barley grain in late lactation, so barley grain went from 24 to 6%, beet pulp went from 0 to 17%, starch from 19 down to 12%, not a huge difference. Dry matter intake was the same, so these cows weren't limited by gut fill probably, okay, so, or at least beet pulp had no different effect than barley grain. Milk production actually was higher with the lower starch diet, slightly. There was a trend for it. But the important point was that body gain, change in body condition score, or change in back fat thickness were lower with the low starch, were lower with the low starch diet. So the cows, and so the value of a low starch diet in late lactation is that the cows will not gain as much body condition. They'll keep hopefully producing about as much milk as if you fed the high starch diet. Feed efficiency will be about the same either way, but profitability, if you can find cheaper byproduct feeds, will probably go up. And frankly, from an environmental sustainability standpoint, humans aren't competing with cows for soy hulls. We are, in a sense, competing with cows for corn grain because we could eat the corn directly. But one of the great values of cows is that they can digest fiber that we can't. So from a big picture of feed efficiency, I think it makes a lot of sense that later lactation, if those cows can eat high fiber diets, by all means, let's feed them high fiber diets if it doesn't impact milk production. Okay, I have a few more slides here. I'm going to skip through some of them pretty fast. I want to make one point about protein and energy efficiency and how they relate to each other. In general, if you feed cows, I'll just look at the top two graphs here together first. We fed a number of cows over the last 5 years, diets that were either marginally deficient in protein, 14%, or were adequate for protein, 18%. And when you look at nitrogen capture efficiency, animals fed marginally low protein diets use nitrogen more efficiently, okay? But because they produced a little less milk, they used energy less efficiently. So it's really hard to manage cows to maximize both nitrogen and energy efficiency at the same time. And I'd point out that if you look at a whole host of different cows, when we start selecting for cows that produce milk more efficiently on an energy basis, they likely are doing it on a protein basis too. Because if this looks at the relationship between captured protein and protein intake, captured energy and energy intake, and there are positive relationships, whether you're on the high protein or the low protein diet. But in the future, certainly balancing protein sources and perfecting bypass amino acid blends can help us maximize both protein and energy efficiency at the same time. So I just argue if you look at how we think about diets affect feed efficiency, it's not just about minimizing losses in this energy scheme. It's about thinking through how do diets affect partitioning of nutrients and appetite. And no nutrition model does a good job of this. I just close on kind of two slides. One is that optimal feeding requires more than one lactating diet. Okay, it makes a lot of sense. If you want to maximize feed efficiency, then in early lactation, when intake is limited mostly by gut distension, we need to feed diets that have minimum fiber and are high in starch so that we can maximize milk production, maximize feed intake, maximize milk production. Okay, we want high feed intake at this time. Okay, we may be breeding for cows that eat less, but as a nutritionist, I'm happy when the cows eat more because if they eat more, especially in peak lactation, they're almost surely going to produce more milk. This is a time when we can use expensive supplements. But later in lactation, not only can we use cheaper supplements and lower protein diets, we can feed diets that are low in starch, and we can replace starch with some cheaper byproduct feeds. And this is a time when gut distension is not a major player in regulating regulating how much a cow eats. Therefore, feeding a different diet to these cows, a maintenance type diet, will enable us to get about as much milk without having a gain in body weight, which we don't want once cows hit a body condition score of 3.5. And we can do it cheaper, so more profitably. And from the big picture, we're not using starch, which humans could eat directly. So from an environmental standpoint, I think it would be a good thing. Okay, so we need 2 diets, not just one, for cows after they get through the fresh period. I'm going to not go through this whole slide because I want to make sure we have some time for questions, but I'd be happy to come back to it. If we feed cows diets that have more things that people don't want to eat, cows can produce more food for humans than we actually than the amount of human edible feeds that we give them. Okay, and one thing that was really cool in the study that was in 2019 is that if you look at the recovery of human edible inputs, when you consider what's called a choice scenario, this is Barry Bradford's work, when you consider a choice scenario where people will only eat the things that they want to eat, people don't want to eat soy hulls. They don't want to eat corn gluten feed. Could we survive on those things? Well, probably not very well, but we could eat some, okay? We don't want to eat a lot of things that cows eat, but we could eat some of them. So when you consider the choice scenario where people only eat what they want to eat, cows are really doggone efficient, okay? Especially when we feed them a lot of leftovers that people don't want to eat. Cows can give us way more human edible food than we put into them. And then finally, the recovery of lysine, which is for not only animals, but also for humans, one of the more limiting amino acids. The recovery of lysine in Barry's study showed that we could get 500 times, not 500%, but 500 times more lysine for people to eat out of the cows than what we put into the cows. Okay, so take-home points. We want cows that convert milk, feed to milk efficiently and profitably. Effective breeding to increase feed efficiency requires continuing to select for more milk components while also selecting against body size and residual feed intake in the net merit. Effective feeding to increase feed efficiency requires consideration of nutrient interactions for digestion and metabolism, and consideration of diet effects on the regulation of feed intake and nutrient partitioning. One diet cannot do this for all lactating cows. Okay, we need not only the fresh diet, but we also need a peak cow diet, and we need a maintenance diet for cows in later lactation that have already hit a body condition score of about 3. Computer models do not accurately predict intake and partitioning. The nutritionist who's on the farm needs to help the farmer to actually assess those types of things. And I didn't talk about this at all, but I will just say that greater feed efficiency may not do much to try to reduce methane emissions in North American cows. Feeding fat looks like it might help a little bit. There are some new additives that look promising, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to use those, because in order for us to have a viable industry in the future, we're going to have to, cows really are not that big of a problem in terms of global warming, in my opinion, at least not North American cows. Our cows are a small contributor to our total greenhouse gas output. But if the consumer decides it's a problem for us. So we need to think carefully about how can we decrease methane output. And finally, I'd just say that making milk is an efficient process. Cows can convert poor quality foods into high quality food for humans. We don't want to forget that. We need to make sure consumers hear that message. And when we feed cows, it makes sense to try to use byproduct feeds whenever we can, because that increases efficiency of human edible food inputs. With that, I'd be happy to take a few questions. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be
Sharing
right back to
screen.
answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
Every expectant mother knows that what she eats impacts her baby. And now research shows that is also true for our cows. Maternal consumption of ReaShure during late gestation had a positive effect on the in utero calf, setting her up for better health and potentially even higher milk production once she joins the milking string. Learn more at balchemanh.com/launch and launch your herd for life.
All right, Mike, let's start with your first question here. How will cows in the future be different than the cows of today? Will we need to feed them differently? And will the data we collect on cows today be relevant?
So I think that, yeah, I mean, as you can see, in the last 50 years, cows have changed tremendously. We went from an average, you know, the average milk production has doubled, right? And even more than that if you go further back. So there's no, and because of genomic selection and because of reproductive technologies, when I was in grad school 40 years ago, the generation interval was considered to be about 7 years, right? Now it's way lower than that. We can get a heifer, take eggs from her at 6 months of age and or even younger, 3 months of age, get the next generation and inseminate them in vitro and have a new generation in a year. And with genomics, we can select for multiple traits. In some cases, maybe not more accurately than traditional breeding values, but with pretty high accuracy, and we can make changes way faster than we ever did before. So if we, as an industry, decide we want cows that are healthier, they'll be healthier. If we want cows that produce more protein than fat, we could probably do that. If we want cows that are smaller, they can be smaller. So I've heard some people talk. You know, Jack Britt is a friend of mine. I really like talking to Jack. His vision for the future is that we're going to have cows that are bigger, producing 50,000 pounds of milk or more. I think he might even, I don't know how much, but I'm just not sure whether we want that or not. So you saw how big. You look at the udder of a cow today compared to the udder of 50 years ago. Her udder is considerably bigger. Is that will consumers at some point say, I don't like that? That just seems like poor animal welfare. I think we need to be really thinking about what are consumers thinking, because if consumers decide that they would rather get their milk and their cheese from plant-based alternatives, it's over. We probably won't get them back. So as much as I'd like to breed just for feed efficiency and milk production, I think we really need to think about what's the consumer perception of our industry, and it seems like it can change so fast. So will we need to feed them differently? I think that what we for sure want to do is make sure that we can feed cows in the future to feed milk efficiently without as much starch as we feed today. So in the Midwest, we of course feeds diets that are like 30% starch, 26% starch and up is really common. In Michigan, we typically feed 33% starch to our high producing cows. I just wonder if that's going to continue. Okay, the day will come when people will say, you know what, we don't need to feed corn to cows, we could eat that directly. So we need to think about that for the future. But the way we're selecting cows right now, we've done numerous tests where we've looked at we put cows on a typical diet we feed in Michigan now, or Wisconsin, with a diet that would be much lower in starch, maybe 12 to 15% starch, have a lot of soy hulls, and the cows that were most feed efficient had the lowest RFI with the high starch diet, also had the lowest RFI with the low starch diet. So I think that as we select the cows right now, using the data we have now, those will still be the most efficient cows in 50 years.
All right, thank you, Mike. Brian says great talk, particularly on the starch effect on NDF digestibility. How does the new NRC differ from CNCPS?
So I have to admit, I don't know a lot about CNCPS, but to mine, I think what they have in their system is an effective pH. At least they once did. And in the end, I think we're going to have a bigger impact on NDF digestibility than the CNCPS does. And that's partly because we just have a lot CNCPS will probably change too. But we have a lot of data now that was not available even 10 years ago. So.
All right, thank you, Mike. Joanne would like to know, are we missing something in genetic selection for feed efficiency, given that SNPs don't evaluate mitochondrial DNA? In other words, could mitochondrial genes, which code for some basic cellular functions, be responsible for a portion of the variation in maintenance energy requirements?
Yeah, good point. You could be right. I'm sure you're right, but yeah, we haven't done much with that yet. And that's something that has been studied before. You know, that's the maternal inheritance side. So I suppose there certainly is some, there are mitochondrial genes that are not controlled, of course, by the animal's nuclear DNA, but yeah, that's something we should look at too.
All right,
the only thing I'd say about that is that, you know, how do you make most of the change in the dairy industry is through the sires. Okay, so the sire isn't giving you the mitochondrial DNA. We're kind of limited by what we can do. So mitochondrial DNA might be important, but that's on the cow side, not the sire side. So the way we make our major impact is through sires, not through cows.
All right, thank you. Glenn is asking, lactose is a lower nutrient for humans, at least in cheese production. Will it be possible to select for lower lactose milk in the future?
Yeah, that I don't know. The thing about lactose is if you're going to turn on the genes for protein, you're probably going to turn on lactose production, which is the osmotic regulator. Could you select for milk that has less lactose? Yes, I suppose you could find cows that have more genes for casein and less genes for alpha-lactalbumin. So yes, to a certain extent.
All right, the next question comes in from Rodrigo. How should we use the second NASEM, the 2021 equation to predict dry matter intake using dietary characteristics? This equation should this equation replace the first one with animal inputs?
Yeah, so if you've looked at the model, you can see there, yeah, for those of you who don't know, so the new NASEM software, which I imagine somebody will implement in a model that works more easily on farm, has a prediction for intake that's a more typical, it's a modification of the last NRC's prediction, which is it's a function of cow body weight, of milk production, and with the current prediction is a little more complicated than the last one. Again, it's a function. Dry matter intake is a function of body weight, parity, milk production, body condition score, and that's the animal equation. And so that may tell you that a cow is going to eat 56 pounds of feed per day, and then you can balance your diet based on that predicted intake. As you balance the diet and you have a certain amount of NDF, and the NDF has a certain digestibility and a certain amount of forage NDF, all of those things go into another equation that's the animal fiber equation. And that equation is going to give you a different predicted intake. If the diet's really high in fiber, especially forage NDF, the predicted intake will probably be lower. So what you could do is then say, okay, let's just flip to that. Let's keep an eye on that predicted intake. This is what I would do for high producing cow, is I would look at that predicted intake, and as I think about, am I feeding a diet that meets the cow's requirements, I'd look at that predicted intake too. And I want to feed a diet where that predicted intake is as high as it can be, as long as I meet the NDF requirement to keep the cow healthy. Yeah, our original idea was that you would toggle that equation on or off, so you could just see how it impacts, at least see how the feed factors would affect feed intake. I would certainly start with the animal equation before I use the feed and animal equation.
All right, we're getting a little long in time here, so I'm going to have one more question. This one comes in from Laurent. To determine the RFI, it is necessary to have a theoretical ingestion. The different equations proposed by international systems often give very different results. How can this genetic value be enhanced on cows raised in countries with very different rations? As an example, pastures, grass silage, co-products that are almost non-existent in the US.
Yeah, so it's really important that you realize that when we think about RFI, I know that some people have published RFI using the predicted intake coming from a model like NRC. That's not ever the way that it was intended to be used. The way that it's intended to be used is you're basically looking at herd mates. So you rank cows for efficiency, well, actually for do they eat more or less than expected when they're all fed the same diet at the same time at the same place. So they're in the same environment, the same weather conditions, same light conditions, same management conditions, all of that, the same stuff that geneticists thought about when they talked about herd mates. And at least in our hands, we've looked at diets that were either high or marginally deficient in protein. We've looked at diets that were high in forage, and milk production took a hit of about 7 pounds per cow per day versus typical diets. So we've looked at diets that were either high in corn grain or high in soy hulls. And in all three of those different types of scenarios, the cows that were most efficient on the high starch diet were also most efficient on the other diets. I'm sorry, high starch or the high protein diet, they were also most efficient when they were fed the lower protein diets. So I think that as long as, when you breed for a cow with low RFI, I expect her to also be more efficient when you put her on a considerably different situation in a different country, fed different diets.
All right, and I'm going to take back my promise. I'm going to ask one more question. Clay is asking that I ask, are Jerseys or crossbreds more efficient than Holsteins?
That's nasty. That's a terrible question to end on, because I am going to make somebody upset, no matter what I say. And I'll just preface it by saying I grew up on a Holstein farm. I love black and white cows, but there are some good things to be said about Jerseys, and Jerseys have not been as enamored by size as Holstein breeders have over the past 50 years. So while the Jerseys kept plugging away at increasing milk production, the Holstein people, too many of us, were enamored by big cows and started breeding for taller show ring type cows. Those cows were not more efficient, as I hope I convinced you of. But if you look at the data, there just are no good head-to-head comparisons of Jerseys and Holsteins. I know you can find some in the Journal of Dairy Science that purport to be. However, in one of them that people often cite, there were no actual feed intakes measured. The feed intakes were predicted based on NRC models. Well, that's not helpful. I do know of one study that was never published that came out of California where they looked at the top Jersey farms and the top Holstein farms in California, and then they looked at all the feed going into the farm and the milk and body tissue, body weight leaving the farm, and the top Holstein, top Jerseys, those numbers for feed efficiency were about the same. So I think both, but I will say with the new net merit index, I think Holsteins are going to start moving in the right direction instead of getting bigger and bigger. And I expect that, there's a place for both breeds. Crossbreeding, there's a place for that because crossbreeding gives you hybrid vigor. That may do something even more for feed efficiency, but I think there's a place for all the breeds in improving feed efficiency and in our dairy industry for tomorrow. There are other things in the size debate that we don't have time to get into. Hot weather Jerseys may have advantages. So there are certainly other things to go into that whole debate, and I think feed efficiency is probably not the main reason to choose one over the other.
All right, good answer, Mike. I'm not sure you upset anybody. So that's going to do it today for us. So thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continue with new and timely topics for our ruminant audience on the first Tuesday of every month. Visit balchem.com/realscience for more details and to register. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Don't forget that the full complement of podcasts supporting the new NRC series is now available through your favorite podcast platform or by visiting balchem.com/podcast. Subscribe to the Real Science Exchange so you don't miss an episode. Be sure to request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt. Learn how at balchem.com/podcast. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. VandeHaar, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.